In 334 BC, the Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, spanned 3 continents, and commanded the loyalty of tens of millions of subjects across dozens of nations and languages. Its army numbered in the hundreds of thousands when fully mobilized. Its treasury at Persepolis alone held more gold and silver than any power in the ancient world had ever accumulated in one place. It had stood, in one form or another, for 220 years, longer than the United States has existed as an independent nation. The man who destroyed it was 22 years old when he crossed into Asia with roughly 40,000 soldiers, a force so small relative to Persia's total military capacity that many at the Persian court considered the invasion barely worth serious attention. If you had been King Darius III in that year, ruling from a palace whose splendor visitors described as beyond anything in the known world, commanding satraps across dozens of provinces and treasuries that had been filling for generations, would you have lost sleep over a young king from a small kingdom on the far side of the Aegean? Darius did not. He had reasons not to. Macedon was, by the standards of the great empires of the age, a minor regional power on the fringe of the Greek world, and its new ruler had only just survived a chaotic and violent succession that many observers assumed would leave him too preoccupied with securing his own throne to mount any serious foreign campaign. What happened over the following decade is one of the most brutal and thoroughly documented case studies in the history of imperial collapse, and military academies around the world still teach the specific battles, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, as textbook lessons in tactics, psychology, and the fatal cost of underestimating an enemy simply because he is young. This is the story of how the greatest empire on earth fell to a man barely out of his 20s, and why, if a handful of decisions had gone differently, it never had to happen that way at all. Consider the numbers alone for a moment. At its peak, the Achaemenid Empire covered approximately 5.5 million square kilometers, making it, by most modern calculations, the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen relative to the total world population at the time, administering a population historians estimate at somewhere between 17 and 35 million people, a staggering figure representing perhaps as much as 40 to 50% of the entire population of the planet in that era. No political entity in human history to that point had ever governed such a proportion of humanity under one crown, and yet all of it, the treasury, the satrapies, the royal road, the immortals, 2 centuries of continuous dynastic rule, proved unable to withstand a coordinated military campaign led by a king still in his 20s, commanding a fraction of the manpower available to his opponent. Understanding exactly how that happened requires going back to the very beginning, to the moment a minor vassal people on the Iranian plateau first decided they no longer wished to serve anyone else's crown. Before 550 BC, the Near East was divided among several roughly comparable powers, none of which possessed the strength to dominate the others outright. The Medes controlled a substantial kingdom stretching across much of the Iranian plateau, having grown powerful enough over the preceding century to participate in the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. Babylon, under the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, held the wealthy river valleys of Mesopotamia and had itself recently humbled the kingdom of Judah, deporting its population and razing Jerusalem's temple. Lydia, in western Anatolia, commanded enormous mineral wealth from its gold-bearing rivers and had built a reputation for military and commercial sophistication that made it one of the most respected powers in the eastern Mediterranean world. The Persians themselves were, at this point, a collection of loosely connected pastoral and agricultural tribes inhabiting the region of Persis in the southern Iranian plateau, technically subordinate to Median overlordship and possessing no history of independent political power on any scale comparable to their neighbors. Cyrus changed that reality within a single generation, in a transformation so rapid that ancient historians themselves struggled to fully explain how it had happened. Beginning as a regional Persian leader ruling under Median authority, Cyrus unified the scattered Persian clans into a coherent military and political force, exploiting both his own considerable charisma and growing resentment among Median nobles toward their own king, Astyages. In a campaign whose specific details are recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus and corroborated independently by Babylonian chronicle tablets discovered in the 19th century, Cyrus defeated and deposed Astyages around 550 BC, absorbing the entire Median kingdom's territory, administrative structure, and trained manpower into what would become the Achaemenid Empire, named for Cyrus's ancestral royal clan. His next target was Lydia, ruled by the legendarily wealthy King Croesus, a name that has entered the English language itself, in the phrase "rich as Croesus." The decisive engagement turned on a detail that later became one of antiquity's most frequently cited examples of psychological and tactical warfare. Cyrus positioned camels at the front of his battle lines, understanding correctly that horses unfamiliar with the animal's unusual scent would panic and refuse to advance. The Lydian cavalry, famous throughout the eastern Mediterranean for its quality and discipline, broke and scattered in confusion before the fighting had properly begun, and Lydia's capital at Sardis fell to siege shortly afterward, bringing its fabled wealth under Persian control. By the time Cyrus turned his attention toward Babylon, he was no longer leading a tribal confederation scraping together whatever advantage it could find. He commanded an empire already spanning most of the Iranian plateau and the whole of Anatolia, built in barely 2 decades from a starting position that most contemporaries at the beginning of his reign would have considered entirely hopeless for a vassal people with no prior history of independent conquest. What made Cyrus's achievement so remarkable to later historians was not simply the speed of his conquests, but the specific manner in which he retained the loyalty of newly absorbed peoples. Unlike many conquerors of the ancient Near East, who routinely deported defeated populations, destroyed local religious institutions, or imposed the victor's own gods and customs by force, Cyrus consistently allowed conquered administrative systems, local elites, and religious practices to continue functioning largely intact under new Persian oversight. Median officials retained positions of genuine authority within the growing empire rather than being purged wholesale. Lydian economic and commercial practices continued largely undisturbed. This pattern, established from the very earliest days of Achaemenid expansion, would prove essential to the empire's ability to govern such an enormous and culturally varied territory for the following 2 centuries without constant, empire-wide rebellion. Babylon in 539 BC was widely considered one of the most heavily fortified cities in the ancient world, protected by massive double walls that later Greek writers ranked among the wonders of the age. With the Euphrates River running directly through the city's center and providing both water supply and an additional defensive barrier, a direct assault against such defenses risked enormous casualties and could easily fail outright. Cyrus's engineers instead solved the problem through an approach that avoided a prolonged and costly siege entirely. According to Herodotus, they diverted the Euphrates' flow upstream into an existing marsh basin, lowering the river's water level within the city enough that Persian soldiers could wade into Babylon along the exposed riverbed under cover of darkness, timed to coincide with a religious festival when the city's defenses were least alert and much of the population was occupied with celebration. Babylonian chronicle tablets from the period describe the city falling with minimal bloodshed and disruption, a stark and deliberate contrast to the destruction that so often accompanied ancient conquest and that Babylon's own armies had inflicted on conquered cities in living memory. What Cyrus did in the aftermath of the conquest established the governing philosophy that would define the entire empire he was building for the next 2 centuries. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, discovered during British Museum excavations in the 19th century and now displayed there, records his declaration allowing conquered peoples across the former Babylonian territories to maintain their own religious practices, restore their own temples, and return displaced populations to their homelands. Among the specific beneficiaries were the Jewish population that Babylon had forcibly deported and held captive for roughly 6 decades. Cyrus permitted them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their destroyed temple, an act recorded independently in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Ezra, which describes Cyrus by name as an instrument of divine restoration, an extraordinary level of positive regard for a foreign conqueror in Jewish religious literature. This was not simple generosity for its own sake. It was calculated, strategic governance of a kind rarely practiced with such consistency by earlier ancient empires. An empire spanning dozens of distinct peoples, languages, religious traditions, and historical grievances could not realistically be held together indefinitely through force and garrison troops alone, and Cyrus understood, with unusual clarity for a ruler of his era, that populations left free to practice their own customs and worship their own gods had far less incentive to revolt than populations whose entire cultural and religious identity was under active, ongoing suppression. This principle, meaningful local autonomy in exchange for tribute, loyalty, and military cooperation when called upon, became the operating philosophy that let the Achaemenid Empire govern a staggering diversity of subject peoples with a comparatively light administrative and military footprint relative to the sheer scale of territory involved. The Cyrus cylinder's significance extends well beyond its immediate historical context. In the 20th century, it was reinterpreted by various political movements as an early declaration of human rights, and a replica has been displayed at the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of tolerance and cultural respect. Modern historians caution against reading 21st century human rights concepts directly into a 6th century BC royal inscription, primarily concerned with religious restoration and legitimizing conquest in terms the Babylonian population would find acceptable. Nonetheless, the practical consequences of Cyrus's policy were real and measurable. Temples across former Babylonian territory were restored, displaced cult statues of local deities were returned to their original shrines, and populations that had been forcibly resettled generations earlier were permitted to return home, an approach to imperial governance that stood in genuine contrast to the practices of the Assyrian and earlier Babylonian empires that had ruled the same territories before him. Cyrus did not live to see his empire reach its full and final extent. He died in battle against the Massagetae, a fierce nomadic confederation inhabiting the steppe region east of the Caspian Sea, in a campaign whose specific details differ considerably across surviving ancient sources, but whose fundamental outcome remains consistent across all of them. The empire's founder died fighting personally on its frontier, sword in hand against a formidable enemy, rather than peacefully in his own palace, surrounded by the comforts his conquests had accumulated. His son Cambyses II inherited both the throne and his father's expansionist ambitions, and turned his own attention southwest toward Egypt, one of the last great independent civilizations of the ancient Near East, and a prize whose agricultural wealth and ancient prestige made it an irresistible target. At the decisive Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC, Persian forces reportedly exploited deep Egyptian religious reverence for cats, associated with the goddess Bastet, by painting images of the feline deity directly onto their shields and driving actual live cats and other sacred animals ahead of their advancing battle lines. Egyptian soldiers, calculating correctly that Persian commanders were counting on, hesitated to fight in ways that might harm or offend creatures central to their own religious practice. Whether this specific account, preserved by the later Greek writer Polyaenus, is precisely accurate in every detail or somewhat embellished in transmission, Egypt fell decisively to Persian control, adding the immense agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley and Egypt's ancient prestige to an already vast and growing empire. Cambyses' death some years later, under circumstances that ancient sources describe inconsistently, triggered a serious succession crisis that brought Darius I, a member of a collateral branch of the royal Achaemenid family with no direct claim through Cambyses' own line, to power only after suppressing multiple rival claimants who each sought to exploit the resulting chaos for their own advantage. Darius proved to be the empire's single greatest organizational and administrative mind, a ruler whose reforms would define Persian governance for the remainder of the dynasty's existence, and under his lengthy reign, Achaemenid territory reached its absolute maximum extent, pushing eastward decisively into the Indus Valley region of present-day Pakistan. For the first time in recorded human history, a single unified political authority controlled territory spanning 3 continents simultaneously: Asia, Africa, and portions of southeastern Europe, an administrative and military achievement of such scale that it would not be meaningfully matched again for centuries until the later expansion of Rome under its own most successful emperors. The eastern campaigns that brought the Indus Valley under Persian control also opened trade and cultural contact between the Iranian plateau and the Indian subcontinent that would persist long after direct Achaemenid administrative control eventually receded. Persian administrative terminology, coinage standards, and even certain architectural conventions can be traced in the archaeological record of the northwestern Indian subcontinent from this period, evidence of a genuine cultural exchange facilitated by imperial conquest rather than simple military occupation. Darius himself commissioned an inscription at Persepolis, specifically listing the peoples of his empire, a remarkable document that names populations from the Indus to Ethiopia to the Greek cities of Ionia, giving modern historians one of the most complete contemporary pictures available of just how vast and genuinely diverse the Achaemenid Empire had become by the height of his reign. Governing territory of this almost unimaginable scale required administrative innovation that historians of ancient governance still study today as an early model of sophisticated pre-modern imperial organization, one whose specific solutions would echo in later empires that consciously borrowed from Persian administrative precedent. Darius divided the empire into approximately 20 provinces called satrapies, each governed by an appointed satrap who held considerable local authority over taxation, justice, and regional administration, but who reported directly to the king and was subject to periodic inspection by royal officials, sometimes referred to by later Greek sources as the eyes and ears of the king, inspectors who traveled the empire unannounced, specifically to verify that satraps were governing honestly and remaining loyal. This system balanced meaningful devolved regional power, necessary given the sheer distances involved, against a persistent mechanism of central oversight designed to catch corruption or incipient rebellion before it could gain dangerous momentum. The Royal Road, stretching roughly 2,600 kilometers from the administrative capital at Susa to the western city of Sardis, was engineered specifically to move troops, government officials, and trade goods across the empire's enormous breadth with unprecedented speed and reliability for the ancient world. Alongside it ran a relay messenger system using mounted riders stationed at regular intervals along the entire route, each rider covering a fixed segment before handing off urgent dispatches to a fresh rider and fresh horse, allowing messages to travel the entire length of the road in about 7 days, a journey that would take an ordinary unaided traveller nearly 3 months on foot. Herodotus's admiring description of these relay messengers, who, according to his account, continued their relay through any weather without pause, is frequently cited today as the likely inspiration for the modern unofficial motto associated with postal services in several countries. The empire's military elite was an elite infantry corps known to the Greeks as the Immortals, numbering exactly 10,000 soldiers at all times as a matter of fixed policy. Any soldier killed, wounded, or otherwise removed from active service was immediately replaced from a standing reserve, preserving both the unit's precise numerical strength and its powerful psychological aura of permanence and inexhaustibility in the eyes of allies and enemies alike. Economically, Darius standardized imperial currency with the introduction of the daric, a reliably weighted and purity-controlled gold coin whose consistency facilitated trade and taxation across the empire's vast internal market, further cementing the administrative and commercial cohesion that allowed such a geographically sprawling and culturally diverse territory to function, for generations, as something approaching a single integrated economic system. Darius's reforms extended into legal administration as well, with evidence suggesting he commissioned the compilation and standardization of existing legal codes across various provinces, rather than imposing an entirely new Persian legal system by force. Egyptian sources from his reign describe him reviewing and codifying existing Egyptian law, an approach consistent with the broader Achaemenid pattern of governing through existing local institutions rather than replacing them wholesale. Tax obligations, too, were carefully calibrated by province according to each region's specific economic capacity, with Herodotus providing a detailed breakdown of the tribute expected from each satrapy, a level of administrative record-keeping and fiscal planning that impressed even Greek observers who considered themselves, not entirely without justification, the intellectual superiors of the barbarian Persians they so often found themselves at war with. The Persian court itself was a genuinely cosmopolitan institution, drawing officials, scribes, and advisors from across the empire's many conquered territories, rather than restricting positions of influence purely to ethnic Persians. Elamite, Babylonian, and Aramaic all functioned as administrative languages alongside Old Persian, with surviving administrative tablets from Persepolis, the so-called Persepolis Fortification Archive, discovered by archaeologists in the 1930s and still being translated and studied today, recording the day-to-day logistics of an empire that moved grain, wine, and livestock across enormous distances to feed royal workers, traveling officials, and diplomatic missions. This archive alone has fundamentally reshaped modern scholarly understanding of Achaemenid administration, revealing a level of bureaucratic sophistication in areas like rationing, labor management, and supply chain coordination that ancient Greek sources, written by cultural outsiders often hostile to Persia, had never adequately conveyed. In 499 BC, Greek cities scattered along the Ionian coast of western Anatolia, under Persian administrative control for several decades by this point, ever since Cyrus had absorbed the region following his conquest of Lydia, rose in open revolt against their Persian governors, driven by a combination of local grievances over taxation and a genuine desire for the kind of political self-governance that mainland Greek city-states enjoyed. Athens, sympathetic to fellow Ionian Greeks by shared cultural and linguistic ties, and understandably wary of continued Persian expansion toward the Aegean and mainland Greece itself, sent a modest contingent of ships and soldiers in support of the rebellion, participating directly in a raid that resulted in the burning of Sardis, the regional Persian administrative capital in Anatolia, and the same city where Cyrus had once triumphed over Croesus decades earlier. The Ionian revolt was eventually suppressed by Persian forces after several years of fighting, but Darius's fury at Athenian involvement in the destruction of an important Persian regional capital became, according to Herodotus, something close to an obsession. Herodotus records that Darius ordered a servant to repeat the phrase "Remember the Athenians" to him at every single meal, a deliberate ritual ensuring the insult was never allowed to fade from his memory or his political priorities. In 490 BC, having spent the intervening years preparing, Persian forces crossed the Aegean Sea by ship and landed on the plain of Marathon, roughly 40 kilometers from Athens itself, intending to punish the city directly for its role in the earlier rebellion. What followed stunned observers across the ancient Mediterranean world. The heavily outnumbered Athenian phalanx, employing the tight, disciplined, heavy infantry formation that Greek city-states had spent generations perfecting through constant practice and shared civic military obligation, decisively defeated the Persian landing force in a battle whose casualty figures, as reported by ancient sources, show a staggering disparity between the two sides. It was the first major military check on Persian westward expansion in the empire's history, and it demonstrated, for the first time in a way the wider Greek world could not ignore, that Persian numerical superiority did not automatically translate into guaranteed battlefield dominance against well-organized, well-motivated Greek heavy infantry fighting on terrain and under conditions that favored their particular style of warfare. The Athenian victory at Marathon also produced one of history's most enduring, if historically questionable, legends, the story of a messenger named Phidippides, who supposedly ran the entire distance from the battlefield back to Athens to announce the victory before collapsing and dying from exhaustion, a tale that inspired the modern marathon race distance. Whatever the truth of that particular story, the psychological impact of the victory on Greek self-confidence was undeniable and lasting, transforming Marathon almost immediately into a foundational symbol of Greek civic identity and martial pride that would be invoked repeatedly in the following decades whenever Greek states needed to rally resistance against renewed Persian pressure. Darius died in 486 BC, before he could organize and launch the full-scale invasion he had begun preparing in response to the humiliation at Marathon, leaving that unfinished mission to his son and successor, Xerxes I. Determined to succeed decisively where his father had fallen short, and facing considerable internal pressure to demonstrate his own capability as a new and still relatively untested king, Xerxes spent several years assembling what ancient sources uniformly describe as the largest invasion force yet seen in the ancient world. Soldiers, sailors, and support personnel drawn from every corner of the empire's vast and ethnically diverse territory, from Ethiopia to India. The engineering required to move this enormous force into Europe was itself a remarkable achievement, one that ancient writers dwelled on at length precisely because of its unprecedented scale. Persian engineers constructed elaborate pontoon bridges across the Hellespont Strait, separating Asia from Europe, lashing hundreds of boats together across open water so the massive army could march directly from Anatolia into Europe on a continuous roadway without requiring a difficult and time-consuming naval crossing for each individual military unit. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BC, King Leonidas of Sparta, leading a force of roughly 300 elite Spartan soldiers alongside several thousand allied Greek troops from other city-states, held the pass against the full weight of the Persian army for 3 consecutive days. The extremely constrained terrain funneling the vastly larger Persian force into a narrow bottleneck, where their overwhelming numerical advantage counted for remarkably little against disciplined heavy infantry holding a fixed defensive position. The defense held firm until a local Greek man named Ephialtes, seeking financial reward from the Persian camp, revealed to Xerxes' commanders a hidden mountain path that allowed a Persian detachment to circle around and outflank the Greek defenders from behind. The Spartan rearguard, according to the tradition preserved in Herodotus and later commemorated at the site itself, fought to the very last man, rather than retreat or surrender, buying critical additional time for the rest of Greece to organize a coordinated defense. A sacrifice that has become, in the centuries since, one of the most extensively studied and most frequently romanticized last stands in the entire history of Western military tradition. The scale of Xerxes' invasion force itself has been debated extensively by modern historians, since Herodotus's own figures, reportedly well over 1 million combatants, are now widely regarded as substantially exaggerated, likely reflecting the sheer psychological impact the invasion made on Greek memory, more than any literal troop count achievable by ancient logistics. Modern estimates, based on analysis of what ancient supply lines and available manpower across the empire could realistically sustain, generally place the actual invading force at somewhere between 1 and 200,000 soldiers and support personnel. Still an enormous army by ancient standards, and still vastly larger than any single Greek city-state, or even a coalition of them, could hope to match in raw numbers. With Thermopylae finally fallen, Persian forces marched south largely unopposed and occupied Athens itself, discovering the city already evacuated in advance of their arrival. Persian troops burned the Acropolis and its temples, a devastating symbolic blow intended to break Greek morale entirely, but one that failed, contrary to Persian expectations, to produce the political surrender and capitulation that Xerxes had confidently anticipated from a Greek world he assumed was now thoroughly beaten. The Athenian naval commander Themistocles, recognizing that the Greek fleet could not hope to defeat the far larger Persian navy in open water, where superior numbers would prove decisive, engineered a deliberate trap designed to negate that numerical advantage entirely. He lured the massive Persian fleet into the narrow strait of Salamis near Athens, where its considerable size became an active liability rather than a strength. Ships packed too closely together to maneuver effectively began colliding with one another in the confusion, while the smaller and considerably more maneuverable Greek vessels methodically isolated and destroyed the disorganized Persian battle line, piece by piece, throughout the engagement. The stunning defeat at Salamis, combined with Xerxes' growing personal anxiety that Greek naval forces might sail north and destroy the Hellespont pontoon bridges, potentially trapping his massive land army in Europe with no secure route home, convinced the Persian king to personally return to Asia with a substantial portion of his forces, leaving a considerable remaining army under the command of his trusted general Mardonius to continue the campaign in his absence. That remaining Persian force was decisively and comprehensively defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC by a combined Greek army drawn from multiple city-states united in common cause. A defeat that ended, once and for all and beyond any realistic hope of revival, Persian ambitions of conquering and permanently subjugating mainland Greece. The naval battle at Salamis has been analysed extensively by military historians as an early and instructive case study in how geographic terrain can neutralise an otherwise decisive material advantage. The Persian fleet, drawn substantially from the ships and crews of Phoenician and Egyptian subject territories rather than ethnic Persians themselves, was almost certainly technically the more experienced maritime force in open water conditions. Themistocles' specific genius lay in recognizing that forcing the engagement into the tight, confined strait would strip away that advantage entirely, reducing the contest to a question of maneuverability and coordinated tactics rather than raw numbers or individual crew skill. A lesson in exploiting terrain to offset material disadvantage that military commanders would study and apply in conflicts for millennia afterward. Xerxes was assassinated by a high-ranking court official years after his humiliating retreat from Greece, an act of palace violence that marked the first in a recurring and increasingly damaging pattern of internal court intrigue, succession disputes, and outright regicide that would plague the Achaemenid dynasty with growing frequency through the remainder of its history. Rather than continuing costly, high-risk direct military campaigns against a mainland Greece that had already demonstrated its capacity to inflict serious defeats, subsequent Persian kings adopted a more indirect and considerably cheaper strategy, funding rival Greek city-states to exhaust themselves fighting one another, most notably contributing substantial financial support that helped prolong the devastating Peloponnesian War fought between Athens and Sparta for nearly 3 decades. The Peace of Callias, concluded in 449 BC, formally ended direct large-scale hostilities between the Persian Empire and the major mainland Greek states. Effectively acknowledging a stalemate, neither side could realistically break through further military confrontation. But peace with Greece did absolutely nothing to solve the empire's much deeper and more corrosive structural problems, which continued to worsen steadily regardless of external military pressure. Egypt revolted repeatedly across the following decades, each rebellion requiring costly military reconquest that drained resources without addressing the underlying grievances driving the unrest. Babylon proved chronically restive as well, its ancient civic pride and periodic economic hardship combining to produce recurring unrest that royal administrators struggled to permanently suppress. Distant satraps, wielding substantial regional military and financial power, and separated from direct royal oversight by enormous and difficult-to-traverse distances, increasingly began acting with a degree of independence that bordered on, and in several documented instances, crossed fully into, outright defiance of central royal authority. Perhaps most consequentially for the empire's long-term military capacity, the Persian armed forces themselves began relying with increasing heaviness on hired Greek mercenaries to fill out their fighting ranks, particularly in elite infantry roles that native Persian and subject troops had traditionally filled. Soldiers whose fundamental loyalty was to their payment and their immediate commanding officer rather than to any deeper conviction about serving Persian imperial interests, and whose growing presence throughout the military quietly signaled, to anyone paying close attention across the wider Mediterranean world, that Persia's own vast subject populations were no longer reliably supplying the military manpower, discipline, and dependability that the empire had commanded with such apparent ease at the height of its power under Cyrus and Darius. This dependence on Greek mercenaries created a particularly bitter irony that later Greek historians did not fail to notice and comment on extensively. The same city-states whose citizen soldiers had once decisively repelled Persian invasion at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea were now, within a couple of generations, supplying the professional soldiers propping up Persian military campaigns and internal power struggles for pay. Xenophon's famous account of the March of the 10,000, Greek mercenaries who fought for a Persian royal claimant and then had to fight their way home across hostile Persian territory after his death in battle, offered Greek readers an unusually detailed first-hand glimpse into just how vulnerable and internally divided the supposedly invincible Persian imperial heartland had actually become by the early 4th century BC, information that Philip and later Alexander would have had direct access to when planning their own invasion. The specific episode Xenophon documented deserves particular attention, since it directly foreshadowed the strategic calculation Philip and Alexander would later make. In 401 BC, a Persian prince named Cyrus the Younger hired roughly 10,000 Greek mercenary hoplites to help him seize the throne from his own brother, King Artaxerxes II. Despite winning the decisive battle at Cunaxa, Cyrus the Younger was killed in the fighting, leaving the victorious Greek mercenaries stranded deep in hostile Persian territory with no employer, no clear leadership, and a hostile Persian army between them and home. Xenophon himself, one of the mercenaries present, helped organize their remarkable fighting retreat of well over 1,000 kilometers back to Greek territory, a campaign he later documented in his work Anabasis. The lesson Greek strategists drew from this episode was unmistakable. A comparatively small, disciplined Greek force had marched deep into the heart of the Persian Empire, defeated Persian troops in open battle, and fought its way back out again, despite losing its own commander partway through the campaign. If 10,000 mercenaries with no unified political backing could accomplish that much, what might a unified, purpose-built Macedonian invasion force achieve? While Persia managed its slow but steady internal decline, across the 4th century BC, a formidable new power was rapidly consolidating itself in the mountainous north of the Greek world. King Philip II of Macedon, through a combination of military reform, strategic marriage alliances, calculated diplomacy, and outright conquest, systematically unified the historically fractious and perpetually warring Greek city-states under unified Macedonian military and political leadership, creating, for the first time in Greek history, a single coordinated Greek political and military force capable of sustained large-scale action rather than the endlessly shifting collection of independent, mutually suspicious states that had characterized Greek politics for centuries. Philip openly and repeatedly declared his firm intention to invade Persia, deliberately framing the planned campaign as long overdue and thoroughly justified retribution for Xerxes' burning of Athens over a century and a half earlier, a framing calculated to unite formerly hostile Greek states behind a shared cause of pan-Hellenic vengeance against their historic common enemy. Before he could personally launch that ambitious invasion, however, Philip was assassinated in 336 BC by one of his own royal bodyguards, under circumstances involving personal grievance, court intrigue, and possibly wider conspiracy that remain genuinely debated by historians even today, over 2,000 years later. His son Alexander, only 20 years old at the time of his father's sudden death, inherited the Macedonian throne amid considerable political chaos and immediately faced open rebellions from several Greek states who correctly calculated that the sudden change in leadership represented a rare opportunity to break free of Macedonian domination, while the new, untested young king remained vulnerable. Alexander crushed these revolts with swift and deliberately brutal decisiveness, most notably ordering the complete destruction of the historic city of Thebes as an unmistakable warning to any other state considering similar defiance, securing his political position firmly before turning his full attention eastward toward the Persian campaign his father had planned but never lived to execute. His army was built around the formidable Macedonian phalanx, armed with the sarissa, an unusually long pike measuring up to 6 meters that created a dense, bristling wall of overlapping spear points that no conventional infantry formation of the era could easily penetrate or break through in direct frontal engagement. Across the Aegean, King Darius III of Persia reportedly dismissed the young Macedonian king as an inexperienced upstart, posing no serious or credible threat to an empire of Persia's established scale and resources. Alexander's education under the philosopher Aristotle, whom Philip had personally engaged to tutor his son for several years, deserves mention here as well, since it shaped the young king's worldview in ways that would influence his later conduct throughout the Persian campaign. Aristotle's teachings on statecraft, ethics, and the natural world gave Alexander an intellectual framework that combined with his father's military training to produce a commander who approached conquest not merely as a soldier, but as someone genuinely curious about the cultures, sciences, and governance systems of the territories he conquered, an inclination visible later in his systematic collection of scientific specimens and observations during the Asian campaign, and in his repeated willingness to adopt local customs and administrative practices rather than simply imposing Macedonian systems wholesale onto conquered Persian territory. In 334 BC, Alexander led approximately 40,000 soldiers across the narrow Hellespont Strait and into Asia proper, beginning the campaign that would eventually consume the rest of his short life. Upon setting foot on Asian soil, he reportedly hurled a ceremonial spear deep into the ground and publicly declared the entire continent a gift from the gods to be won by conquest, a bold and deliberately theatrical symbolic gesture of confidence from a young king that many across the Mediterranean world still privately doubted could actually deliver on such sweeping ambition. Persian forces stationed throughout Anatolia gathered their available regional troops at the Granicus River, hoping to end the invasion decisively and permanently before it could gain any further momentum or draw additional support from disaffected Greek cities under Persian control. Alexander personally led the crucial cavalry charge directly across the river under fire, nearly losing his own life in vicious close combat when a Persian noble's blade came within a hair's breadth of splitting his skull entirely, saved at the critical moment only through the timely and decisive intervention of his loyal officer Clytus, who cut down the attacking noble just before the fatal blow could land. The resulting victory shattered organized Persian military resistance throughout Anatolia and opened the entire strategically vital region to rapid Macedonian control with startling and, to Persian commanders, deeply alarming speed. At the ancient city of Gordium, Alexander famously encountered the legendary Gordian knot, an impossibly complex tangle that no one before him had ever managed to successfully untie, accompanied by a long-standing local prophecy that whoever finally loosed it would go on to rule the whole of Asia. Alexander, according to the most widely repeated and celebrated version of the story, simply drew his sword and cut the entire knot apart in a single decisive stroke, a bold, almost theatrically decisive solution that would come to perfectly mirror his entire subsequent approach to the massive military and political challenge still lying ahead of him. The victory at Granicus also revealed something important about Alexander's leadership style that would characterize his entire campaign: his consistent willingness to personally lead from the front rank rather than direct battles from a safe distance behind his lines, a practice that inspired fierce loyalty among his troops but repeatedly exposed him to mortal danger throughout the following decade of continuous warfare. Ancient sources record numerous occasions on which Alexander suffered serious wounds in personal combat, a pattern of behavior that Persian commanders, accustomed to a royal tradition where the king typically remained at a protected distance from direct fighting, appear to have significantly underestimated when assessing the psychological and tactical impact of facing an enemy commander willing to risk everything, including his own life, in every single engagement. Recognizing at last the genuine and rapidly growing seriousness of the threat Alexander posed, King Darius III personally assembled and led a massive royal army out of Babylon to confront the Macedonian invader directly, rather than continuing to delegate the response to regional satraps and local commanders as he had done previously. Through a skillful and rapid strategic maneuver, Persian forces managed to march around and position themselves behind Macedonian lines near the coastal town of Issus in 333 BC, threatening to cut off Alexander's vital supply routes back to the coast and effectively forcing him to abandon his own planned advance and turn back to fight on ground that Darius, not Alexander, had chosen. That chosen ground, however, ultimately favored Alexander far more decisively than Darius could have anticipated. The battlefield's unusually narrow width, tightly squeezed between steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other, prevented Persia's considerably larger and more numerous army from ever fully deploying its true overwhelming strength, effectively neutralizing the primary strategic and numerical advantage that Darius had specifically counted on when accepting battle. Alexander drove his elite companion cavalry, in a focused, aggressive charge directly at the weakened Persian center, aiming with characteristic boldness straight for Darius's own elevated chariot and personal position. When mortal danger drew visibly and unmistakably close, Darius lost his nerve and fled the battlefield entirely on horseback, abandoning his own massive army to collapse into total disarray and confusion behind him, without its commanding king present to hold the line together. Among the significant captives left behind in the chaotic Persian retreat were Darius's own mother, wife, and daughters. Rather than harming, ransoming harshly, or publicly humiliating them as many conquerors of the era routinely did, Alexander treated the captured royal Persian women with considerable and genuinely notable respect and dignity befitting their elevated status. A carefully calculated act of magnanimity that substantially enhanced his growing reputation even among Persian nobility who might otherwise have viewed him purely as a barbarian invader. The Battle of Issus also produced a striking piece of visual evidence that survives to this day. The Alexander mosaic, discovered in the ruins of Pompeii and now housed in the Naples National Archaeological Museum, believed to be a Roman-era copy of an earlier Hellenistic painting depicting the exact moment Alexander's cavalry charge broke through toward Darius's chariot. The mosaic captures Darius's expression of alarm as his charioteer wheels the vehicle around for retreat, offering modern viewers a striking artistic record of how ancient audiences visualized this pivotal moment centuries after the actual battle took place, and demonstrating just how deeply the confrontation between these two men had embedded itself in the cultural memory of the ancient Mediterranean world. Following his decisive victory at Issus, Darius sent formal envoys to Alexander offering a negotiated peace, along with a substantial portion of Persian territory and a large ransom for his captured family members. But Alexander flatly rejected the generous offer outright, demanding instead to be recognized as sole and undisputed king of all Asia. Nothing short of total, complete victory would now satisfy his openly expanding ambitions. The heavily fortified island city of Tyre, home to the largest remaining operational Persian naval base in the eastern Mediterranean, refused outright to surrender or even negotiate meaningfully with the advancing Macedonian forces. Lacking sufficient naval vessels of his own to take the well-defended island directly by sea, Alexander ordered the construction of an extraordinary nearly 1-kilometer causeway extending across open water directly toward the island fortress, a genuinely remarkable feat of ancient military engineering that ultimately took a full 7 months to complete under constant, determined harassment from Tyrian defenders throughout the entire construction process. When the city finally fell after this prolonged siege, thousands of its inhabitants were killed outright or sold into slavery as a deliberately brutal demonstration intended to discourage any other city along his path from even considering similar prolonged resistance. Egypt, by striking contrast, welcomed Alexander enthusiastically as a genuine liberator rather than as yet another foreign conqueror, having chafed resentfully under direct Persian administrative rule for generations and viewing the young Macedonian king as a far preferable alternative. He was formally crowned pharaoh according to traditional Egyptian religious ceremony, and following a difficult personal journey to the remote desert oracle at Siwa, Egyptian priests there reportedly declared him to be the divine son of the god Amun, a significant religious endorsement that further cemented his political legitimacy among his newly acquired Egyptian subjects, while simultaneously feeding and reinforcing his own steadily growing personal sense of unique destiny and divine favor. While in Egypt, Alexander also made the decision to found a new city near the mouth of the Nile that would bear his own name, Alexandria, a settlement he personally selected for its excellent natural harbor and strategic commercial position connecting the Mediterranean world to Egypt's interior. Though Alexander himself would never live to see the city grow beyond its initial foundations, Alexandria would go on to become one of the greatest centers of learning, culture, and commerce in the entire ancient world under his successors, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and a population that, at its height centuries later, rivaled any city in the Mediterranean, a legacy arguably as significant to world history as any of his military conquests, born from a decision made almost in passing during a campaign whose primary focus remained squarely on defeating Darius. Darius, determined to end the growing Macedonian threat once and for all through overwhelming force, assembled the single largest military force the exhausted Persian Empire could still muster from across its remaining loyal territories, by most surviving ancient accounts, a force 3 or 4 times larger than Alexander's entire invading army, on the open, flat plain of Gaugamela in 331 BC. He specifically had the ground carefully leveled and cleared of obstacles in advance, intending to make full and devastating use of scythed war chariots and armored war elephants, both weapons specifically designed to shatter infantry formations when deployed across flat, unobstructed terrain, offering no natural cover or barriers. Alexander responded to this careful preparation with a subtle but ultimately decisive tactical maneuver, deliberately marching his own battle line at a diagonal angle to steadily draw Persian forces further and further out of their carefully prepared defensive positions, eventually creating dangerous gaps and inconsistencies in the Persian formation as it attempted, with increasing difficulty, to match his continuous lateral movement across the battlefield. When a critical gap finally opened in the weakened Persian center as a direct result of this strain, Alexander immediately led his elite cavalry through it in a focused, decisive strike aimed once again squarely at Darius's own commanding position. History repeated itself with brutal and, for Persia, catastrophic precision. Just as he had done previously at Issus, Darius lost his composure entirely as mortal danger closed in around him and fled the battlefield a second consecutive time, once again abandoning an enormous assembled army that immediately collapsed into total chaos and disorganized rout without its commanding king present to provide leadership or maintain morale. The comprehensive defeat at Gaugamela effectively and permanently ended Persia's practical capacity to ever field another army of comparable scale again. Ancient accounts of Gaugamela also preserve a detail that later military historians have found especially instructive. Prior to the battle, Alexander's own senior generals, alarmed by the sheer visible scale of the assembled Persian host stretching across the plain, reportedly urged him to launch a surprise night attack to offset the disparity in numbers before the sun rose. Alexander refused, reportedly declaring that he would not steal his victory but win it openly in daylight, a decision that some historians read as calculated psychological confidence building for his own troops, and others as a genuine reflection of his personal conviction that a decisively won daytime battle would carry far greater symbolic and political weight than a tactically safer nighttime ambush, whatever additional risk that choice entailed for his numerically inferior force. The night before the battle also produced one of the more famous anecdotes preserved about Alexander's temperament under pressure. While his officers reportedly spent the hours before dawn in anxious preparation, unable to sleep given the overwhelming size of the Persian force arrayed against them, Alexander himself slept so soundly and for so long that his general Parmenion had to personally wake him on the morning of the battle. When asked how he could rest so easily facing such odds, Alexander is said to have replied that Darius had already done the hard work for him by gathering his entire remaining strength into a single force at a single location, sparing Alexander the trouble of hunting down scattered Persian armies one by one across the empire's vast territory. Whether or not the exchange happened exactly as later writers recorded it, the anecdote captures something genuine about the psychological confidence that had come to define Alexander's leadership by this stage of the campaign, a confidence built on 2 consecutive victories against a numerically superior enemy, and one that Darius, having fled the field twice already, could no longer credibly match. Following the decisive collapse at Gaugamela, the great cities of Babylon and Susa both opened their gates to Alexander's advancing forces without any further meaningful resistance, surrendering vast accumulated stores of gold, silver, and other treasure, representing well over 2 centuries of continuous imperial accumulation and taxation. A final desperate last stand mounted by the Persian general Ariobarzanes at the narrow Persian Gates mountain pass, often compared by later historians to the Greek defense at Thermopylae, but fought in reverse with Persians defending against Greek invaders, briefly delayed but ultimately could not permanently halt the relentless Macedonian advance toward the imperial heartland. Alexander's forces finally reached Persepolis, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the entire Achaemenid Empire, a city whose extraordinary architectural splendor and sheer accumulated wealth exceeded anything his soldiers had personally witnessed anywhere else throughout their long campaign across 3 continents. Thousands upon thousands of camels and other pack animals were ultimately required simply to transport the treasure accumulated there across more than 2 centuries of uninterrupted imperial rule and taxation. During an extended night of celebration fueled heavily by wine and the intoxication of total victory, Alexander allowed, and by several detailed ancient accounts, actively encouraged and even personally participated in, his soldiers to burn the magnificent palace complex completely to the ground. Ancient historians consistently frame this specific act as calculated and deliberate retribution for Xerxes' earlier destruction of Athens a full century and a half before, transforming what began as simple drunken celebration into a symbolically loaded act of historical vengeance, regardless of whatever precise personal motivations actually drove the decision in that particular intoxicated moment. Archaeological excavations at the Persepolis site, conducted extensively throughout the 20th century, have confirmed clear physical evidence of the fire's destruction, with burn layers and collapsed, scorched architectural remains visible across much of the palace complex to this day. Some modern historians have questioned whether the burning was purely impulsive or represented at least a partially calculated political decision, since the destruction of Persepolis symbolically and definitively announced to every corner of the vast former empire that Achaemenid rule was finished beyond any possibility of restoration or revival, potentially discouraging any residual hope among Persian loyalists that the old dynasty might somehow still be salvaged or returned to the throne under different circumstances. The treasure captured at Persepolis and the other major Persian cities was, by any ancient standard, almost incomprehensibly vast. Ancient sources describe the total haul from Susa and Persepolis combined as exceeding 180,000 talents of gold and silver, an amount so enormous that Alexander reportedly struggled to find a practical use for all of it, beyond funding his continued military campaigns and the eventual construction projects he undertook across his expanding empire. Modern economic historians have estimated that this single windfall represented multiple decades' worth of the entire Greek world's typical annual economic output, concentrated into a matter of months, an infusion of precious metal into the Mediterranean economy, so significant that some scholars believe it contributed to genuine inflationary pressure across the wider Hellenistic world in the years that followed, as previously hoarded Persian wealth suddenly flooded into active circulation through Alexander's military payrolls, veteran settlements, and new city foundations. Alexander refused to allow the campaign to conclude with Persepolis reduced to smouldering ashes, while Darius himself remained alive and potentially capable of rallying further resistance somewhere in the empire's vast remaining eastern territories. He personally pursued the fleeing Persian king relentlessly eastward across enormous distances, determined to capture Darius directly and permanently eliminate any remaining possibility of organized resistance continuing under his royal authority. Darius's own trusted officials ultimately made that determined pursuit unnecessary. Bessus, a regional satrap governing one of the empire's eastern provinces, who had by this point completely lost all realistic hope of ever turning back the seemingly unstoppable Macedonian advance, staged an outright coup against his own reigning king, placing Darius in chains as a desperate bargaining tool. When Alexander's rapidly advancing forces finally caught up with the fleeing Persian party, they discovered only Darius's already lifeless body. Bessus had murdered his own king, rather than risk allowing his capture alive by the pursuing Macedonians, then fled further eastward himself. Alexander's immediate response became one of antiquity's most frequently retold and admired gestures of chivalrous respect toward a defeated enemy. He personally covered the body of his fallen adversary with his own royal cloak and ordered a full funeral befitting Darius's legitimate royal status, sending the body to be buried with all the customary honors due a rightful Persian king, rather than treating it with the contempt often shown to defeated rivals. He then relentlessly hunted down the fugitive Bessus and had him executed with considerable brutality, framed explicitly and publicly not merely as the elimination of a defeated rival, but as righteous vengeance carried out on behalf of the legitimate Persian king he had personally spent years fighting to overthrow. With Darius dead and Bessus executed, the 220-year-old Achaemenid dynasty came to a definitive and irreversible end. Alexander, at only 26 years old, stood as the undisputed master of the largest unified empire the world had yet seen in the whole of recorded human history. A complete transformation of the ancient world's entire balance of power that had taken barely a single decade to accomplish. Launched by a young king whom Persia's own reigning monarch had once openly dismissed as posing no serious threat whatsoever. What happened to the Achaemenid Empire after Darius's death is, in many ways, as instructive as the conquest itself. Alexander did not simply destroy Persian administrative structures and replace them with something entirely new. He largely retained the satrapy system Darius had built 2 centuries earlier, appointing loyal Macedonian and Greek officers to govern provinces using much of the same administrative machinery, tax structures, and even in many cases the same local officials who had served under Persian rule. The royal road continued to carry messengers. The Daric-influenced coinage system continued to facilitate trade. In a very real sense, Alexander conquered the Persian Empire's territory while inheriting and preserving much of its governing infrastructure, a testament to just how effective and durable the administrative innovations of Cyrus and Darius had actually been, even as the ruling dynasty itself was violently swept away within the span of a single decade. The deeper lesson that military historians and students of empire continue to draw from this collapse centers on a pattern that would repeat across numerous later civilizations. The gap between an empire's accumulated wealth and territorial extent, and its actual military and political resilience, under sustained pressure from a determined, capable adversary. Persia, in 334 BC, possessed every conventional advantage: vastly superior numbers, seemingly limitless financial resources, generations of administrative experience, and control over territory spanning 3 continents. What it lacked at the critical moment when everything was tested was a king capable of matching Alexander's tactical brilliance, personal courage under fire, and psychological resilience when battles turned against him. Darius III was not a uniquely incompetent ruler by the broader standards of Achaemenid history. He had, after all, navigated a difficult succession and held the empire together for several years before Alexander's invasion began. But confronted twice with the specific crisis of imminent capture on the battlefield, he chose flight both times, and each flight cost Persia an entire army it could not easily replace. This is why the Persian collapse remains such a compelling case study nearly 2,500 years later. It demonstrates, with unusual clarity, that empires are not simply destroyed by superior enemy numbers or resources. Alexander never once commanded more soldiers than Darius could field. They are destroyed when the specific individuals holding critical positions of authority fail, at the decisive moment, to make the choices that history retroactively judges as necessary. 3 battles. 3 moments where a different decision by one man might have changed the outcome of each engagement, and quite possibly the subsequent course of world history entirely. Instead, an empire that had endured for 220 years, that had weathered internal rebellions, foreign invasions, and generations of court intrigue, ended within a single decade because its king, tested at the critical moment not once but 3 times in succession, chose the same fatal response every single time. The ruins of Persepolis still stand today in modern Iran, their scorched stone columns a permanent physical record of that final night of fire nearly 2.5 millennia ago. Visitors who walk among them today are walking through the literal ashes of what was, in its time, the largest and wealthiest empire human civilization had yet produced, brought down not by slow decline or gradual erosion, but by a sequence of battlefield decisions made across barely 3 years, by a king only in his mid-20s, against an empire that had underestimated him from the very beginning.